SproutsCast. This is SproutsCast Tuesday edition, story time. Hi, Mrs. Good.
Hello, Mr. Good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, as usual. It's cool to be here. In fact, if you have joined us, why don't you make a comment in the comment section, type your name and who it is, and say that you're watching. Make us feel welcome.
Yes, we want to know that you're here. I'd like to know who I'm reading to. It's different not being in front of our class with the kids and everything, and we're actually talking to a camera, but we really like to know that you guys are here with us, talking to us via the comments that you can put on there. So go ahead and make sure you put your name in your comment, say hi, and I look forward to today. We're going to do some fun stuff after our story, so you guys got to stay put. Don't log off when I'm done with the story.
Yeah, Mrs. Good has a craft to do today. We're going to start doing that. We're going to start doing some crafts, and today's is real simple, but don't log off. Stay with us, and she'll be able to whip this craft out, and you'll be able to do it at home, and that's the whole point of the craft time at the end of story time. So we're studying Jim Elliot, or studying or reading the story, but what's happening this week, Mrs. Good?
So this story, in this particular chapter, if I remember right, they're actually going to start working with some of the missionaries that are in the area, learning the language of the people. I think they actually take a plane trip and maybe a bus ride.
Oh, cool.
And all kinds of fun stuff. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Shall we jump in, Mrs. Good?
We shall. And don't forget, don't log off afterwards. Stay tuned for the craft. So this is going to be chapter 5 of our book about Jim Elliot, One Great Purpose. And we're going to start in chapter 5 with Together Again. So here we go. April 13th, 1952. Jim Elliot waited nervously behind the wire mesh barrier, his eyes focused on the door of the DC-3. The door swung open, and a set of steel steps was wheeled up to it. An elderly man with a cane was the first to appear at the doorway. He wobbled his way down the stairs. Jim leaned forward, easily able to see over the people in front of him. 9 other people climbed out of the airplane, and then Jim's heart skipped a beat. There she was, looking just as he'd remembered her. Tall and slim, her dark blonde hair pulled neatly back in a ponytail. Betty Howard descended the stairs and began walking across the tarmac towards the terminal. Jim could scarcely wait for her to reach him outside the terminal building. The next few weeks zipped by. Although Jim and Betty had continued to write to each other since being students together at Wheaton College, there was something about being able to speak face to face. Betty wanted to know how Jim's older brother Bert and his wife were doing. Bert and his wife were missionaries several hundred miles southeast of Quito in Peru. Jim was anxious to hear how Betty's younger brother Dave and his wife were doing at their mission station in Costa Rica. Mostly, though, they wanted to hear how the other was doing. Although they were not officially a couple, they spent as much time together as they could. Betty fell in love with Quito and its majestic mountain setting, and she and Jim spent many happy hours exploring the place together. They took a bus ride to La Mitad del Mundo, 16 miles north of Quito, where the equator passes through the middle of town. They rambled through the Mercado de Santa Clara market with its brightly painted balsa wood birds, cedar statues, bundles of dried herbs, and enormous bunches of freshly cut flowers. Of course, Jim and Betty kept busy studying Spanish. Most of the places they went, their Spanish tutor went with them, and they would all talk to each other in Spanish the entire time. They had other studies to occupy their time as well. Though Dr. Tidmarsh was not a medical doctor, but was a doctor of philosophy, he had been called on countless times over the years by the Quechua Indians to act as a medical doctor. Since he had learned as much as he could about jungle medicine, he conducted a course on basic medical procedures for several of the new missionary recruits, including Jim and Pete. Jim loved the course. Because his mother was a chiropractor, he had been around the medical field most of his life and found it easy learning about everything from leprosy to jungle nutrition and childbirth. By the time he'd finished the course, he could hardly wait to put all his newfound knowledge into practice. He longed to be about the business of being a real missionary. As his months in keto rolled by, Jim felt that everything was moving much too slowly, especially learning Spanish. A real problem for him was that apart from formal Spanish lessons, he lived in an English-speaking world. Everyone at the Gospel Missionary Union compound wrote and spoke in English. Even the newspapers were all English editions. At the rate he was going, Jim figured it would take him a year or more before he would learn enough Spanish to be ready to move to Shandai. That was much too long for his timetable. He needed a way to seclude himself so he would be forced to think and speak in Spanish 24 hours a day. By May, Jim had come up with a solution. He had been introduced to a Dr. Cevallos and his wife and 7 children. To make ends meet, the family lived in 2 rooms of their house and rented out the 3rd. Dr. Cevallos offered the room to Jim and Pete to live in. The men gladly accepted the offer, and Jim soon found out that living with a Spanish-speaking family sped up his language skills, especially when practicing with the children, who quickly lost their shyness and happily corrected his mistakes. Jim and Pete also agreed not to talk to each other in English, and soon Jim was even dreaming in Spanish. The next month, Dr. Tidmarsh offered Jim and Pete the opportunity to get out of keto for a few days. The mission had undertaken a comprehensive aerial survey of the Central Orient region, and Dr. Tidmarsh asked Jim and Pete if they would like to go to Shalmera to help with it. The 2 of them were thrilled to take part in the aerial survey. The Orient was the jungle region of Ecuador, east of the Andes Mountains. It formed the western reaches of the Amazon basin. For 2,000 miles, the jungle ran eastward from Ecuador all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in Brazil. But more important to Jim and Pete, the Central Orient region was where Shandai was located. At last, they thought they would get a chance to see their future home. The trip to Shalmera was every bit as torturous as Dr. Tidmarsh had described. The bus bumped and twisted its way south past Mount Cotopaxi and towards Ambato. Every half hour or so, it ground to a halt in a cloud of dust, accompanied by exciting shouts. Local people either clambered on or off the bus, and the loudness of the shouting depended on how much luggage they had stowed on its roof. Before getting aboard, each passenger heaved onto the bus roof bags, crates, and sacks containing everything from vegetables to bantam hens. It was a lot more difficult, though, to get those things down than it was to toss them up. Sometimes an item of luggage would get stuck at the bottom of the pile, and everything had to be unloaded to retrieve it. It seemed to take forever. Then the mass of passengers would crane to see out the windows, making sure all of their belongings were reloaded and not left behind. Dr. Tidmarsh had warned Jim and Pete not to get off the bus during these stops. There was no scheduled time for the bus to leave the town or village, and if they happened to be too far from the bus when the driver decided it was time to go, they would be left behind without a second thought. At every stop, vendors took advantage of the captivity and the hungry passengers on board. Of course, Jim and Pete were standout targets. The vendors seemed to think that the rich gringos would automatically want to buy some of their tasty goodies. Everything from homemade lemonade poured into bottles to whole roasted guinea pigs, complete with hair, paws, and teeth. Finally, at lunchtime, the bus arrived in Ambato, the so-called gateway to the Orient. Jim remembered reading about a destructive earthquake that had hit the area 3 years before, and the damage from it was still visible. Many of the stone buildings lay in ruins or had collapsed roofs. But life seemed to go on despite the damage. Golden brown cocoa beans were spread to dry among the rubble, and small boys ran nimbly over the rocky piles. From Ambato, the route veered to the east and dropped steeply through the town of Baños, where Jim and Pete bought bananas and mandarins. As the bus moved on into the eastern jungle, the scenery was suddenly completely different. Lush green vegetation laced through with masses of orchids grew right up to the edge of the rutted road. As the bus bumped along, the snow-capped peak of the volcano, Mount Sangay, came into view. Jim studied the map to get their bearings. They were now in the Central Orient and close to their destination, Shelmera. Finally, the bus navigated one more dog-legged bend, rolled along for a half-mile, and screeched to a halt outside a general store with a sign that read, Shelmera. They had arrived. Jim felt like pinching himself. First, to see whether it was true that he was in the upper reaches of the Amazon jungle, and then to see if he could find some circulation in his numb legs, which had been cramped into the tiny, hard bus seat for 13 hours. Jim and Pete were the only ones who got off the bus. Waiting for them was a man who strolled over and shook their hands. He introduced himself as Bob Wittig, the Missionary Aviation Fellowship, MAF pilot, who would be helping them with the survey. Bob led them a short distance back up the road to the MAF station. As they walked, Jim counted about 30 buildings in Shelmera. From talking with Dr. Tidmarsh, he knew the town had been hacked out of the jungle by the Shell Oil Company, hence its name. The town had served as Shell Oil's base for oil exploration in the Orient. 3 years ago, the company pulled out of the region. It sold most of the buildings at a bargain price to the Gospel Missionary Union, which established the Berean Bible Institute in the buildings to train local Indian Christians. The road to the MAF station ran parallel to a long, neatly cleared airstrip. At the end of the airstrip on the other side of the road stood a tin-roofed house. "Here we are. This place is a pilot's dream," said Bob Wittig, waving his hand towards the hangar next to the house. Inside the hangar was a 4-seat, yellow Piper Pacer aircraft. A trail led from the hangar across the road and out to the end of the runway. "Nate knew what he was doing when he set this up," he added admiringly. The man Bob Wittig was referring to was Nate Saint. Nate had built the house and hangar in 1948 when he arrived in the Orient to establish a base for Missionary Aviation Fellowship. Nate was a jungle pilot and airplane mechanic, and his wife Marge was an excellent radio operator and hostess. Together, they ran the MAF base that serviced a number of mission stations dotted across the surrounding jungle in the Orient. Jim had heard great things about Nate and Marge from the missionaries in Quito, though he wasn't going to be able to meet them on this trip. They were back in the United States on furlough, and Bob and Keitha Wittig were filling in for them. Keitha Wittig welcomed Jim and Pete into the MAF house, which was named Shelmerita, meaning Little Shelmera. Soon they were all seated on folding chairs and sipping juice. The cool juice was refreshing to Jim after the long bus ride from Quito. As Jim continued to enjoy it, Bob Wittig explained the plan for the survey. He would fly Jim and Pete over large tracts of jungle while they scanned the area for settlements and marked them on a map. Then they would have a better idea of how many Indians lived in the area and where. It sounded great to Jim and Pete, Pete, and the week of surveying sped by. When they were finished, many small and previously unknown settlements were marked on the map. What the men didn't have on their map, though, were any dots showing Auca Indian settlements. The Aucas were the people Jim's informant had told him about 2 years before at the Wycliffe Summer Institute in Oklahoma City. Only sketchy details were known about this obscure tribe. Bob Wittig told Jim that 2 months before, the Aucas had killed a family of 5 Quechua Indians who had accidentally strayed into Auca territory. The Aucas had a reputation for showing no mercy. Killing seemed to be a way of life for them. According to Bob, from a very young age, the Aucas learned the ways of hatred. Small children were sung lullabies with lyrics based on the names of the people whom that family hated and wanted to kill. No one in a family group was ever allowed to forget whom they had grudges against. Since every act of murder had to be avenged by another act of murder, a cycle of killing continued unbroken. It was even rumored that in some Auca settlements, there were scarcely a person over 20 years of age. All the adults had been murdered. This just made Jim more anxious than ever to find a way to break that hatred and to show the Aucas that there was a better way to live. Still, Jim would have to be patient. He had more Spanish lessons ahead of him before he would be able to return to live in the jungle permanently. And of course, he had been called to work with the Quechua Indians. However, he told himself that while he was doing that, he would keep an eye out for opportunities to reach the Aucas. Before Jim and Pete headed back to Quito, Bob Wittig flew them over Shandai and pointed out the thatched roof of Dr. Tidmarsh's abandoned house. Since the airstrip was completely overgrown, they were unable to land to take a closer look. Still, at least Jim had an aerial view of his future home fixed in his mind. Back in Quito, Jim told Betty everything he'd seen and learned in the Orient. Jim and Pete had seen Shandai. Now they were even more eager to master the language and make the move to their new location. With but a single obstacle keeping them in Quito, Jim and Pete threw themselves into their Spanish lessons with renewed determination. At the end of July, 5 months after arriving in Quito, Jim and Pete got some great news. According to Dr. Tidmarsh, they had made such good progress learning Spanish that they didn't need a whole year of lessons. It was time for them to start making plans to move to Shandai. In preparation, Jim and Pete sorted through all the equipment and supplies they had brought with them from the United States. Since they wouldn't be able to take everything with them to Shandai at once, they sorted out those things that would be useful immediately and placed them in 2 backpacks and 2 other bags. The rest of their belongings were stored away at the Gospel Missionary Union compound. While Jim and Pete were getting ready to move to Shandai, Betty was making plans of her own. She had heard of the need for missionaries who could translate the Bible into the Colorado Indians' language. To help with the translation work, she and her newly assigned partner, Doreen, would live in San Miguel, a remote village about 15 hours' drive west of Quito, on the other side of the Andes Mountains. Much to his dismay, Jim learned that it would take a letter 6 weeks to get from Betty in San Miguel to him in Shandai. He wished she would be stationed somewhere closer and more accessible, but he knew that, like him, Betty had been called to work among the Indians of Ecuador and must go where God was leading her. Still, he had enjoyed having her close by during their stay in Quito. Now, it was time to do what God had called him to: minister to the Quechua Indians in Shandai. And that is the end of chapter 5. So we are going to leave it off there. So now I'm going to move up here closer to the table so that I can show you guys this very simple, really cool little craft. And I want to show you what it's going to look like, and then I'll show you how to do it. So this is what it looks like. Let me see if I can get it close to the camera so that you can see it. See how you carve different colors out of it? So this is how we're going to make it. You're going to need a blank piece of paper. You should be able to find that anywhere. It does not have to be this big. It can be little. It can be as big as you want it. It's just going to require more coloring the bigger that it is. So you put it down. The next thing you need is a little box of crayons. The darker the colors for your crayons, the better this is going to work. And you need at least one black crayon. So I've got my black in here. Let me pull it out because we don't want to use that one just yet. That's the end. So you pick out colors and you just start coloring on your page with that color, however big you want it. So I'm going to make a little stripe of pink on there, and then next to it, I'm going to make a little stripe of blue, and I'm just going to do that with a whole bunch of different colors. You can do it however you want it until you have whatever part of the paper colored with as many of the different colors as you feel like using in whatever order you're going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and do this real quick. This is something that I used to do when I was little. Maybe some of you have done it in the past before. I don't know. Some of you may like to color more than others. But I always enjoyed doing this and then hanging pictures on my wall because it was always really pretty. So here I've got several different colors. Whole bunches of them side by side like that. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take your black crayon and you're going to color really dark over all the colors that you just put on the paper. You really got to press because you want it to cover up the colors. So you're going to go one way and scribble all over it, and then if you have to turn it and go the other way so it covers all the colors up, that's what you need to do. You got to make it all black on the top so that you can't see the colors very well at all underneath there. So I'm going to break my crayon in half apparently, and we'll just keep going and we'll get this done. Mr. Good is laughing at me in the background, and I think so is Mr. Tyler. I think Pastor is too. All three of them are laughing at me. Can you guys believe that? They're laughing at me. So here we go. I think I've got this pretty dark. So I'll show you guys that. I've got the colors all covered up with black. Again, you can make it on as much of the paper as you want. You can make it the whole page. If you want to color a big picture, it'll just take more time. So then you're going to get a pen or maybe a stylus that you use for your Game Boys or something like that that has nothing sharp but a scratchy end on it. And you're going to scratch a picture into the black. So I'm going to draw, let's see if I can get it to work here, a heart in mine. And it comes out looking nice and colorful. You can see my little heart right there, and it's all rainbow colored. So you guys can do that. You can draw a picture of whatever you want. You could write a Bible verse in it and hang it on your wall. It's just a simple little craft that you could do. I'd like to see some of your pictures. So if you guys do this and you post it in the comments, I definitely want to see them. I want to see how artistic some of you guys are and how creative. So that'll just be something fun and simple that everybody can do. And I hope that we will have another chance to get together and come up with another craft. I look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday, and you guys have a wonderful night.